everybody. We're going to start the next session now. So we introduce Mr. Travers, Amanda Wick, Dr. Mark Staples, and Katja from NIST, who's online. That will be saying hello to just a moment. So Mitchell, all yours.
Yeah, so everyone, thank you firstly for coming to the game block night. It's phenomenal to have you all here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and this discourse, and hopefully the production of documents, so that we can build these practical outcomes that we're speaking about. So it's a pleasure, and it's also a pleasure, of course, to have Amanda and Rama on the panel and Katja online. Oh, I can see her now. Welcome, Katja. Great. So we've had an introduction from both Amanda and Mark. So maybe Katja, if you could jump in and introduce yourself, and then I'll get going with the questions. We can start with that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. My name is Katja Delak. I'm a staff person at NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. We're part of the Department of Commerce, and I work with a team of researchers, probably about 6 to 8 researchers who have interest in blockchain and blockchain-related technologies. And with these colleagues, I help to inform the future direction of our own work and perhaps the contributions that we have to standards organizations and so forth. I hope that's a sufficient introduction. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually remember when we were designing our governance systems. I sort of used to run an exchange. I used the NIST standards in order to manage all of that sort of access management, disaster controls, and those sorts of pieces. So it'd be really nice to have the NIST conversation bring into this practical, sort of, as I said, building these self-regulation outcomes that we can contribute to the greater industries, and then we're able to move forward. So I'll start with the first question. This is a little bit of a hairy one, actually. So I think it should get things going. But when we think about sort of the way that blockchain protocols are created, right? So you've got Bitcoin, which is proof of work, and then Ethereum did the transition to proof of stake. Now, proof of work is really an incentive-based algorithm system based on mathematics, right? However, then when we start talking about these sort of standards and practical outcomes, who is to determine what proof of work is in sort of financial systems? Who is to determine what the sort of terminology around proof of stake is? Is it the job of the engineer and get to Soulbis code as law, or is it the job of organizations like this to debate and then have discourse around what is proof of work, or is a staking token, what is a sort of currency in the system? So I sort of would like to open the question there. Let me know if I need to clarify a little bit more, but it was a suggestion from Professor Matsu.
So I don't know, it doesn't need to be, I mean, proof of work is kind of already out there as a concept already. It's kind of emerged as, you know, from the Bitcoin ecosystem. It has a meaning there, which is kind of realized in the source code that's running in the platform, discussed in the papers, and so, you know, I don't think it kind of needs further definition, really. Proof of stake, I mean, there's lots of different proof of X kind of consensus mechanisms out there. To me, proof of
Participation.
Yeah,
that's another one that's coming on this.
Yeah, to me, they're all of them I kind of lump together as kind of underneath what sometimes called Nakamoto consensus, which is this idea that the kind of longest, heaviest chain wins in some consensus decision, you know, the centralized way. And then, so, you know, that class of consensus mechanisms is different from the other, you know, Byzantine fault tolerant consensus mechanisms. You know, for these kind of platforms, the people who ultimately get to define what it means are the people who have created the platform, they're just developers who are producing this thing and getting it to run. And everyone, the nice thing about definitions, everyone can give their own definitions. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, people sometimes get together and try to get a consensus definition, and that happens. You know, the ISO work I'm involved with is, and we have a vocabulary set, and all the vocabulary items there are available but normally ISO standards are not available for free, but they do give you access to all the definitions for free. Then let's just take a look at proof of work is not defined.
I think that the thing that I would add is just to say, having worked at a startup SaaS company, I think we have to be careful what are definitions and what's marketing. And there's a lot in this industry that is marketing. And then there's some things that are actual definitions, which is I think why folks like NIST and standard setters are so important. Because at some point you have to have terms that are in fact standards, which you then need to be able to distinguish from marketing and spam and new names and things that the ecosystem creates to distinguish itself, right? If you're just another proof of stake protocol, who cares? But if you're proof of participation, well, that sounds really fun, right? And now you're cutting through the noise, and marketing is about cutting through the noise. It's not necessarily creating anything different or anything new. It could just be making a new name, and that's kind of dangerous.
I agree, and I think what's interesting.
If I can say, touching back on what Amanda had talked about in the previous panel, I think one of the things really interesting and salient at this point is, and it also goes into this comment on the marketing, you can have computational notions or very well-defined ideas of what consensus is, but what is it that you have sold to your participants? And what does it actually mean in practice? You know, there's a lot that's been written about proof of work and how many mining pools are actually there in existence, and what does that actually mean for stake or consensus when you are perhaps just a user of the system. And I think we can have numerous standards that define the actual computational or algorithmic methods of consensus, but translating that to the user experience is a completely different thing.
Yeah, I can agree with that. When I was saying that developers get to define it, I mean, they get to create the platform and they might claim that it has properties, but what sort of properties it ends up having, or its emergent phenomena, or its cultural significance, developers don't get to define that, but defined by users or other people.
And then just
Time. That like over time that was the time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I realized it may have been.
no, the only thing I was going to add as a recovering lawyer was that, and then you have the terms and agreements that come in. And I forget which project it was. I'm sure everybody here remembers it. But remember where everybody found out after the fact that they didn't actually get to keep custody, and they only found out when all Celsius. Who was it? Was it Celsius? Or no, it wasn't. It was one of the projects where it might have been BlockFi, but you remember where it was like after the fact, it turns out nobody had read their terms and conditions, and they had basically agreed away like something critical like custody. And if you've never watched the South Park episode about what you're agreeing to in your Apple terms and conditions, I strongly recommend it, because it's so true that most of us don't read that. And that goes back to like something we were talking about earlier, which is with great power in the democratization of finance comes great responsibility. And some of these projects, by the time you get to the user experience, we have not been conditioned to be critical thinkers. We've been conditioned to hit accept terms and conditions. And now what's in there and what it really is and what you're really getting and what the responsibility is so important that we're gonna have to rethink as users. What am I agreeing to? What is this really versus what's been marketed? And going back to Katya's point, like what is the actuality that they're giving users?
Yeah, and that whole problem click through is exactly why Australia, for example, has a lot of consumer and investor regulation, because it doesn't, in a sense, also, you know, it's great that you might have terms and conditions, but if they're just crap, they're not going to satisfy the minimum requirements of consumer protection in Australia. They're worthless. And so, yes, terms and conditions are important. They can enforce your rights, but yeah, that's why we also have a regulation.
Yeah. And you tend to only read the terms and conditions after something goes wrong, and you sort of realize where it can be accountability, rather than upfront, which should be the case.
Yeah, and interestingly, you know, you mentioned terms and conditions versus, the token. The DAO originally is another example of any other on the other side of the coin, where, the Dow white paper said, oh, you can read this white paper as an explanation of the DAO. If you want to know what the DAO really is, look at the source code, it's at its address. Whatever it does is the legitimate behavior, right? And that turned out not to be the case, because everyone said, oh, actually, it's not performing how we thought it should.
Yeah, that's a really interesting case, and I guess why I frame that question that way is part of the purpose of BGIN, and what we've been working on recently is the definitions of the taxonomy, of which we're going to be using when we're writing these documents. So we've had people from the European sort of blockchain commission, I'm not sure the exact phrase, but it's they're working on a taxonomy themselves. So we're looking to try and collaborate globally to try and build these terms to be more sort of rigid, so then we have a better understanding amongst the global network of stakeholders on what we're talking about when we're talking about these things. So then we can actually cut through those marketing terms in the more formal documentation of which goes towards policy decisions. So I guess I'll jump, and I really enjoyed some of the comments that were made in the previous panel. But one of the notes that I wrote down is we almost have this dichotomy going on right now where you've got DAOs on one side where it's blockchain native, the governance, but it's very nascent. So it's really quite difficult for us to actually build governance structures of which find accountability and have execution, and then people to sort of manage those systems. However, then in sort of the incumbent financial system, I would say that the rules and regulations, they're established, they're understood, they've been practiced, they've been developed through many, many years of law and sort of judges and lawyers, etc. However, they're a little bit more rigid, and it's far more difficult to fit them into when you start getting sort of DAO-based governance, tokens, ownership through wallets, having multiple wallets as part of one DAO. So I sort of want to bring that question to the floor here. How do we bridge that gap, that divide between sort of the nascent but the native versus the traditional but more rigid governance structures? Like there must be a way. It's a big question.
Yeah, the smart contracts are not contracts, and DAOs are not necessarily organizations or legal entities. So the sort of legal status of kind of technical thing often relates to the claims made about it when it's created or used or issued or whatever. But so you might have a thing on a smart contract that enables voting or something. That might not be a DAO, or maybe it is, or maybe it's helping to govern some off-chain activity. So I think they're kind of at different levels. I think there is kind of the idea of having people on the blockchain voting on stuff, and then there's entities which are voting on how companies should be run as investable entities, and they're kind of very different. They might use the same substrate, or they might not, but they're kind of quite different from a legal perspective.
Okay, did you want to add? I will add something, but I didn't want to cut you off. If you want to add something, the only thing I would say is that it goes back to something that I think Eric said, and I'll probably be a broken record about it, but I think this is where SRO, or some form of SRO, is really critical. And maybe I'm not answering the question that you're asking, but I'll give you an example. There's an association in the US called Global Digital Assets and Cryptocurrency Association. It's short, it's called Global DCA. But they set out to establish best practices, to have like a code, to even be members of the association. The exchanges had to explain like what their AML policies were, etc. And what ended up happening was the good companies joined, and the ones that couldn't pass didn't. And that was a little problematic, because for a trade association, you want everybody to be in there, but if you set a high standard in an industry that's not yet at that standard, it's tough, because then you have essentially like best actors only in a trade association, right? So what you kind of need is something that says collectively, this is the best practices, this is what we all should aspire to, which then when somebody doesn't meet that, it's an outlier as opposed to just nascent, right? So the industry is nascent, but I tell people like, it's 13 years old at this point. In some countries that's driving and having babies. So can we maybe stop using that as an excuse to not really be kind of where we hope we would be? Because 13 years is a long time. And if we had a more functional SRO system or groups that were coming together to identify best practices, then I think you'd have a little bit more of a back and forth within the band of, okay, if we say these are best practices and they're strong convictions loosely held, then somebody could come in from, more established industries and say, well, this is what we're seeing. New people could come in and say, well, we want to adjust that a little bit, and it would be a conversation. Well, right now, we don't even have an aspirational set of best practices that I know of in these industries, because the industry has been so disorganized that there aren't a ton of best, or at least that's my impression. So if you guys know of different ones, or I'm just like completely ignorant of what's out there, I think the people in this room are the best people, but for me as a somewhat outsider to that discussion, I feel like industry needs to do a better job of getting together and setting those best practices to raise the bar that then requires industry to meet it, as opposed to waiting for regulators to set the bar and then us constantly being below it, if that makes sense.
Do you think we will need best practices almost like per technology type, so like best practices for DeFi, best practices for key management, best practices for XYZ?
I think so, because I think a part of what you're seeing in the US is the problem of when you make too big a tent, right? And what a Coinbase and DeFi thinks is going to be very different than what DeFi companies want. And so I do think the technologies are different and specific. In a perfect world, you'd have a little tent city, right? And each little thing we talk about, that's probably optimistic. But I do think it's very hard and we were talking about this on the break, if your tent is too big, it gets very difficult to speak in one voice on behalf of several different types of technology. And we even have a proof of stake alliance in the US just for staking. We've got, I think you're gonna see more of those that are specific so that you can collectively speak with one voice.
Yeah, I think getting to the point I tried to make before, like we can have, and BGIN talks about blockchain as being a kind of comparable like to the internet, and thinking about, and so if we think about the internet, then there is regulation for the internet, but it's not the regulation that covers online shopping. There's regulation for the internet, but that's not the regulation that covers social media, regulation. So we at the application level, we need to have, or we do have, quite different regulation in each of those areas. So it's kind of, I think, weird to think that blockchain regulation could cover all different kinds of uses of tokens. That's like saying we could have paper regulation that covers all different kinds of uses of paper for contracts or paper plans or whatever. I mean, it's an infrastructure technology, and there's a lot of different uses for it.
But I think one of the challenges, at least we're seeing in the US with the approach of the big tent versus the specialized tent, is I think there's both, in some cases, forum shopping, and then in the other hand is if you are a stakeholder, where do you into which basket do you put your eggs? Because it's not really clear what's going to have the most impact. And I think this plays out a little bit in some of the standards development, is that, one of the reasons things might not be coalescing is because who are the right people at the table, and are they moving the needle forward on the specific issues at hand?
Yeah, that's really great. Something came to mind the previous session, and one of the things that got me into blockchain originally was I was a little bit of a democracy nerd, so I was looking at like different democratic models. I was looking at like direct democracy, I was looking representative democracy, and all of these other things, right? And a paper came out from one of the sort of formative developers in the space around liquid democracy. So liquid democracy, but liquid democracy
Is that perfect? No. That's what I want by liquid democracy.
Yeah.
I feel like that's not what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm going into that. I really need that. So liquid democracy is this concept where you have almost like a delegative democratic system where people are able to provide, everyone has sort of equal vote, but you're able to then delegate your vote to a person of which you trust on that opinion in that space. And I found that really appealing, and that actually looking at those models of how they work is part of the reason why and how I discovered Bitcoin, which is quite neat. So I guess like, is there a way, and this gets to the sort of building our practices, is there a way for us to build almost like a new delegative or representative system in to have that 10 city, make that 10 city possible?
Just briefly, Ms. Carroll, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I had a question which I think might actually dovetail well off of yours guys, but if you want me to tag it on, then maybe we can see if it combines. I'm really glad you brought up the internet piece, because you're right, like blockchain technology itself is like underlying infrastructure. So looking at places where there's examples of governance for like public utility type and like basic infrastructure, I think is really helpful. It's challenging when most of the use cases that we're looking towards in blockchain are financial based, and so there's a different level of expectation of governance, accountability, just expectations for security that gets built in. But given the fact that the underlying tech can support lots of types of applications, just like you mentioned, and honestly, the same conversations we're seeing happening in AI right now, where like it's a pursuit of the regulation of a general purpose technology. And I'm not saying that it's wrong or misguided, but I think that there's some lessons certainly, and possibly like some points of improvement that could be made. And I guess I'm curious, like, how do you see examples of how the structures that we've used for governance of underlying infrastructure and other approaches towards general purpose technologies work in this space, and like how can we leverage those lessons better with this, and then especially the issue of open source technology, governance and accountability. That issue is coming up, like I mentioned, not just in blockchain, but also in AI. It's up in cybersecurity. Like, that issue is coming to bear in so many places. And so I guess I'm just curious for all of your thoughts. I'm sure Katya has some other thoughts too, in the world of NIST, but I guess if there's just any thoughts about what lessons we should learn about governance for the underlying technology or infrastructure, but then also applying it for the financial use cases, and where like should SROs apply to the technology as well, or should SROs really be application based for the use of it? Anyway, so sorry, that's a very long rambling question, but I wanted to just, I thought that it was such a really useful element that Mark was really,
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know, it's lots of infrastructure technologies, there's the telecommunications network, you have sort of common carrier protections that, if there's the crime conducted over the telephone network, it's not the telephone company's responsibility to kind of regulate that. And so I think that kind of pattern is quite common. The banks are not necessarily responsible for criminal activity conducted by people at bank accounts. But they are involved in trying to help authorities control money laundering and counterterrorism finance. So and similarly, telcos, although they're not responsible for the crimes committed over their networks, they help authorities catch people who are using telephone networks like that. So yeah, I don't know what that means for blockchain. I don't know, because there's a lot less, but certainly the public permissionless systems, there is no kind of central operator that can help with these sort of operator level controls for the network level. And there are, but I guess that we are starting to see that with some of the tokens that are being issued, that some of the tokens have operator level controls. Often that's viewed with skepticism, because it's exactly the same thing that enables a rug pull for those tokens. So, I don't know, it's complicated.
I don't know if this, to me, this is sort of addresses your question, but maybe not. When I look at the internet, I think of Section 230 in the United States. For those of you that don't know Section 230, and I'm paraphrasing, Carol knows way more about this than me, but as a prosecutor, when I think of Section 230, I think of the complete application of responsibility that we perform over the internet. Section 230 basically said that if you have a website and somebody publishes something on your website, you're not responsible for what's on it if you're a publisher, right? If you're not putting that content on the website, simply because you have a website that other people put content on, doesn't make you responsible for it. I worked on a case in the United States when I've heard it called Backpage. Backpage was a very popular website that ended up leading to massive amounts of child sexual exploitation. And the problem with the cases was that the individuals involved never be held responsible, even though they absolutely knowingly facilitated a webpage that was absolutely known to do a horrible thing. There were a lot of lessons learned that people have been hoping maybe we could do something a little bit better than Section 230. I think the reason that we're focused on financial services, and this dovetails into something that I talk about a lot, which is, you know, a lot of guys that came from tech, and a lot of guys that came from the internet that got into fintech and then wanted to pretend that the fin wasn't in front of it. And when you're talking about financial services, right, it's different because you're talking about the movement of money, of value. And that's different than publishing on our webpage. Like, so I think sometimes, yes, there's lessons to be learned. The frustrating thing is we're always learning it the hard way. If you watch The Social Dilemma, right, about how all the guys who invented everything basically regretted it later because they never thought about what should we do versus what could we do. And I think sometimes it's as simple as that, whether it's the internet, whether it's telecom, whether it's any of these things. I just think a lot of us wish that we would ask what should we do as opposed to what could we do. And sometimes it's just that simple, but I think that's a huge problem, is that over time, these technologies, it's so fast, and tax liquidation is so fast, social media is so fast, that if you don't adapt and kind of learn from past mistakes, even the things that we've already looked at, we need to kind of modify and adjust. And I don't know if that makes sense or if it kind of addresses your question, but I think there's a lot to be learned about how we handle the internet that we did frankly wrong. And we're learning the ramifications of that because social media made every single example of what could you do versus what should you do evident. And I think a lot of us think blockchain and crypto has a chance to do that better, but what does that look like? You know, that's, I think, why a lot of us are here. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's.
I think the question of what should you do versus what could you do, like, who do you ask? The question, what should you do? Because if you ask a room full of bankers, they should all say, oh, everyone should have a bank account, and that's fine. You know, turn off the blockchain. So, you know, it depends who you ask as well. Yeah.
You know, I think 100% agree. I think going back to your question about liquid democracy, because I do think it ties in. So can we do it differently this time? Because if you watch The Social Dilemma, at the end, they created an ethics, like a foundation to basically talk about ethics in the internet after the fact. And I think a lot of us wish you had injected ethics before you created the like button, before you created filters that would cause body dysmorphia around the world for generations. Like, before you do these things, why don't you integrate the conversation of ethics? And I think this is what people are seeing with AI, is that if you don't do that beforehand, it's hard to stuff that genie back into the model. And so I think that's why groups like this are so important, is there is absolutely an ethics discussion. Who needs to be in that room? I don't know. But when I say what should you do versus what could you do, I'm talking about responsible innovation and ethics. I'm not necessarily talking about like what you said, although I think what you said is a super relevant problem, is depending on who's in the room will dictate that answer. I think we just need to have way more people in the room, which I'm not gonna lie, why I started the Association for Women in Cryptocurrencies, because historically the people who have not been in those rooms tend to be women, and especially in the United States, people of color. So like TradFi tech, largely white men. And if we could get away from that and have way more voices, I think even just that would make things a little bit easier, better.
So now we loop back to the question you asked, which is about how do we get a broader participation. Interesting you brought up. I think one of the things I'll try and find is we plan to co-author the Senate paper, a systematic literature review on blockchain governance in the Journal of Systems and Software. And that's that flags ethics as one of the sort of gaps in the sort of blockchain governance literature at the moment.
You know about the paper smells and taxes and all that happy club. So we should all work favorite.
Yeah, so if only the Center of Human Technology existed before, sort of all of that appropriation in social media existed. So we're actually getting close to time, so I'm going to open. Katya, did you have any final remarks on the conversation that we've had today?
I mean, there's so many things to think about in this space. I think one of the challenges about this whole area is that you have so many sort of social issues intersecting with the technology, and they don't map. This happens all over the place, and it's really optimistic to think that you can use technology to sort of encode certain behaviors, but the reality is that human life is much more nuanced than that. And we can try and use various different methods, be they social or, encoded in an algorithm to try and get the outcomes that we want. But it's going to take quite a lot of discussion on the human level to figure out how we can do that.
A really good point. I was just told that we have about 10 more minutes because we need some of the time. You know, great. Yeah, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I think it's going right now. Oh, okay. So, that's a good for you to jump in whenever you like, of course. So I guess like my question, and we sort of started to get onto it with the liquid democracy. Are there any frameworks that come to mind that can be implemented that have been used? And we've mentioned this before. For blockchain governments, and I would like to actually like specify this question as well around BGIN as well. So when we're thinking about a multi-stakeholder conversation, dialogue, think tank organization, what sort of frameworks do you think that we could do here in BGIN to then be that example of self-regulation to the industry for each of those tenets, for example?
But the role I see for BGIN is kind of like an actor in civil society in a normal kind of country. You're not sort of perhaps defining a technical standard or like defining regulation. You're having conversations about all of that. I think that's the role. Chloe's introduction talked about how this was a conversation, and then taking that out to influence other discussions in other rooms about policy and so on. So I think that's the role of policy.
So you think we should be more agnostic to frameworks, in other words, so rather than sort of comment and analyze them and provide feedback and open the door to them, but not exactly to sort of put a foot in the sand around one or two frameworks around blockchain governance.
If you have because blockchain can be used for so many things, if you have a blockchain governance framework, it's going to be quite generic, and it's going to end up looking like every other governance framework. And it's going to talk about, roles and decision rights, and accountability and incentives, those things are the sort of recurring themes in blockchain, in governance frameworks and in blockchain governance frameworks. So I don't know. I think maybe it is helpful to flesh out some of the kind of blockchain specific aspects of those, and to think about how it's. I guess the conversation here seems mostly to be about permissionless blockchains, but as I said at the beginning, there are different considerations for other kind of forms of deployment. So a public permissionless blockchain is very different from a public permissioned one. Is there a different control mechanisms you might use?
Well, yeah, you could have that sort of single access control that you were mentioning around the telecoms with the
yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Again, I hope this answers your question, but it's what triggered in my mind when you asked it. So a couple of years ago, the New York Department of Financial Services had a tech spring, and they invited a bunch of folks from industry, from government, and they presented a problem set. I think it was 3 different problems, and they said, like, here are 3 problems that we're facing, and get into teams and compete to solve the problems. And what was really interesting was that my team so I was from the analysis of blockchain analytics tool. I had 2 people from FinCEN. I had somebody from DFS. I had somebody from PayPal, from Guidehouse, and then like a private consultant. And I was a former prosecutor. So if you think about that, it was such a perfect little microcosm of the whole ecosystem. And what was fascinating was when we got into discussions about, okay, here's this problem, how would you solve this problem? The natural tension in all of those groups kind of came out and played out, right? So for me, being former law enforcement, I learned all these things, and the guy from House who's now at Soulbis Labs was like, listen, we've got to focus on privacy, so how are we gonna balance privacy? And we literally just hashed it out. And the problem that we came up, the solution that we came up with, tried to address all those things. And I'm really proud to say we were one of the groups that won. I was very excited, I'm very competitive. But the reason I mention it is because it was so inspiring for me. What if we could do this for all the things? Because I don't know about you guys, but for me, like, I didn't know about this until Steve Vallis, but I didn't know BGIN existed until about a week ago when I contacted you, because I was coming for something else. But a lot of these groups, like, as a recovering lawyer, it's lawyers that get together, right? It's the techies that get together, like, they tend to be really siloed. But the beauty of what we did was we had all these different stakeholders in a room talking about these things. And I wonder if you had, instead of like identify a framework, identify a problem and have a bunch of different stakeholders try to answer that problem. But you almost have to have the input and for people to kind of mini hash it out to get like the lawyers, the regulators, right? The developers, the builders, and have those conversations and kind of duke it out before you even propose a solution. Because if one of those stakeholders proposes a solution, it's not going to reflect the realities of all those other groups, the time that it takes to mash through that. So if you can get a representative sampling of kind of a mini ecosystem, I think, and maybe that's what BGIN is, and I'm just excited to have found it, but I think I was amazed at that.
Yeah, I think if you do approach it that way, like tackle a kind of a point problem as an example, maybe, and then think what governance means there, you will probably find that blockchain governance is mostly, there is not all about the blockchain. So any system that we build, blockchain is only ever just one component of a broader system design. You know, at the very least, we have wallets that control the private keys. That's not on the blockchain. But usually for Web3, there's websites, browsers, you know, there's extended ecosystems of people making promises on the web pages about what things represent. So any of these things are broader systems, systems never just on the blockchain by itself.
And to touch on that a little bit, I mean, looking at the problem-based approach, I think we haven't touched on this today so far, but looking at implementations that are use case based, I think each of those tends to, you wind up perhaps more in a private permissioned kind of scenario, but at the same time, you know, you have a different governance system specific to that particular problem that the use case is attempting to address. And so in that way, what Amanda brought up about, you know, defining the problem and how you go about it, I think the solutions in some ways, I won't say they can be crafted with the right stakeholders that come into that scenario. Sorry, did I?
We're just thinking about that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. My screen changed and I wasn't certain what happened, so pardon me.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think that now that I think about it, a few of the papers that BGIN has actually published were very sort of problem focused and problem oriented. So one of the papers earlier this year, the potential risk of stablecoins, that came out of the sort of crisis that happened in the industry around SVB and Circle with USDC, and that received so much feedback and so much involvement from the BGIN organization, and that I think because it was problem based. People were looking for a solution, they were looking for people to discuss and collaborate with, and it did become this multi-stakeholder conversation with people from stablecoins, people from traditional finance speaking about sort of this adverse risk balance that was going on, where it was traditional finance actually influencing the price of the stablecoin. So I think that that's actually really good feedback. So thank you for the panel to take this problem-based approach.
The risk there to manage is that, you know, in looking at a use case, then, you know, you don't overly constrain, you know, your opinions about regulation, because there'll be a whole lot of other use cases that are very different.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say is DFS actually ended up spending a lot of time before they identified the problems, talking with some stakeholders about how to even identify the problem. They went through, I think, multiple iterations, because it turns out like the initial thing that they said, it was like, well, was that even really the problem? So even identifying the problem was a process that folks had to weigh in on to kind of really drill down to, is that in fact the problem? Is that the problem we think? So even identifying the problem can be more complicated than I think they thought.
I want to say a few words on that, around the question of how does BGIN do its multi-stakeholder conversations? And it's exactly that, like microcosm. You know, really, when we set up this Block 9 event, and we've done 2 other in person, the rest of it hybrid, primarily hybrid. And so we wanted to have these like 4 sets of workshops every day, like 2 workshops running at a time. And the workshop on for people to be lectured, the workshops for people to sit down and discuss the problems. And one of which is held by a grant by Chloe White on the stable points paper. And so again, although people haven't put up all their hands yet, this is meant to be open dialogue. It's not meant to be about being arbitrated or authoritated by the main discussants themselves. But again, we want to make this microcosm of the industry. Mitchell coming from the fact that he was an excellent exchange operations is a huge discovery, and then you mix up with privacy, identity, then you come with the theoreticals around like Soulbis' reputation. You have Mitchell, so everything from 3 person years, experts across so many different industries, and range concepts that like, everyone can get microcosm themselves and equally just say the words. But 100% BGIN is all about bridging all these different stakeholders. It is going to be an association all the way down to just individual square who's that are just important that everyone has to see the table, or involves being people by somebody else in another organization. And we want to make sure that we stay close to the roots of decentralization, but equally pragmatic with the way we go about our governance models.
Can I say something spicy?
Oh, please. I'm at any time, please.
I was at a conference, I think it was Digital Dollar Project, and it was meant to be like a roundtable discussion. But the reality is if you don't put people at the table together, it turns into this. The nature of a panel makes it so that you think we're speaking at you. And no matter how much we want you to ask questions, no matter how much we want this to be a dialogue, the very physical nature of us being up here and you guys being over here, you can feel that it doesn't feel like that, right? So maybe tomorrow we just all sit at these tables together and we push them together. We all just sit together and we talk. And then it doesn't feel like we're lecturing, because it's impossible that the physical dynamic makes it feel that you guys are somehow different than us. No matter how much we say, let's all chat together. How many of you really feel super 100% comfortable raising your hands to a panel the same way you would if you were all sitting with you at a table, speaking as equals?
Maybe we a random number generator, once people go back to code, and then you have to speak. See, these are things kind of start exploring like governance models, and like BGIN is meant to be a part of application where we would like to look at like DAO structures in the future and how does that work. And so on token is just one piece we're really keen to do in the future right now, but we have like a 3 to 5 year horizon. That 3 to 5 year horizon is like, okay, great. How do I get people to say something anonymously, pseudonymously, or here we go. Governance.
So it's really on my time. Okay.
He's running.
So I'm very aware as conversations are happening that some of this is going up permanently on YouTube. So I think it might be helpful if we maybe have some opportunities over the coming days to have like chat and house conversations, or just for it to be clear at the start of each session, what's the distribution of the conversations that take place, because that I think is likely affecting participation.
Were these YouTube ones? The ones that run right now?
What's up, John?
Okay. It's definitely a warning ticket.
If there's anything that people want to sense it out, like just let us know. Like this is not being streamed to like it's right here. But great point, honestly. People want to feel comfortable to say things that they actually wouldn't say in their environment. There's a few organizations that we contacted did say to us, please don't list us, please don't name us, but we will attend.
That would be really helpful, because also in the fortnightly working group meetings that we have, there's also been a lot of discussion about whether we use, like, for example, AI note taking. For example, because there's a lot of concern about being able to have debates and honesty, and also often in our working groups and in these block meetings, people want to be able to make comments that are misconstrued as being affiliated with roles they might have in various organizations. So that's one request, I suppose, suggestion slash request. I also was thinking, could we create like a Telegram chat group the next 4 days? Because when we're having live conversation, maybe people don't want to interrupt a really nice flow of conversation, but they have a thought bubble or something that they want to table for later. We could also be kind of like chatting on Telegram in between sessions or something like that. Like,
We do have the discourse, yeah.
Yeah, so we created the discourse forum page for BGIN, and that's sort of a live forum that people can bring up their own topics and conversations. I know that it's not the same experience.
very public as well, which might
Okay.
also mean that if people just want to communicate, but like, you know, where's everybody going to tonight, or, you know, say things that are out of context in Discord, a Telegram group might
We have some,
facilitate a little bit more casual.
discourse like that, instant messaging.
Okay, so I'm a chair, as a chair of the, so I propose that, thank you very much for that suggestion. So let us have the two different channels of communication. So Discord is official channel to discuss about the future work of documentation. But so let us utilize that Telegram channel for the unofficial. Chatham House will best any types of conversation. You know, we have the two different types of communication channel for that. This 4 day discussion.
That's great. So, just back and then, feel free to come up to me. So that we can have the unofficial conversation. And of course, provide access to the chairs to begin. And then on the forum website, discourse, we can have maybe a more actionable public facing commentary where we can start thinking about it and posting the documentation and the policy ideas that we come up with. Yeah, fantastic. That actually brings this panel to a close. I actually kind of enjoy the way that blockchain governance happened right at the end of this panel. It's like that practical application, really did. But yeah, thank you so much, Amanda, Wick, and Mark for getting up and speaking and being the main discussants for this conversation. But yeah, I'll pass back to Joey.
Thank you. Have a good day.
I know there was.